In 2019, President Cyril Ramaphosa promised that South Africa would have a Christmas without load shedding. Now, of course, as is frequently the case, no plan was attached to this promise. It was just a promise into the air. That Christmas, for the first time ever, South Africa had stage 6 load shedding, which meant 10 hours without electricity on a day. An urgent meeting was convened at Megawatt Park, Eskom's headquarters. Of course, Eskom is the power supply in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa, Deputy President David Mabuza, Minister Pravin Gordhan, and several executive members from Eskom were present. At this meeting, it was made very clear what the source of the problem is. The problem is primarily incompetence. After the meeting, President Ramaphosa walked out into a press conference where he was asked about the reason for the high levels of load shedding or power cuts in South Africa. And much to the surprise of the Eskom executives, the president blamed the problem on sabotage, not incompetence. Now, shortly before this, Andre de Ruyter was appointed as the new CEO of Eskom, and his term as CEO was about to start. Now, the question is, how do you deal with something like this? How do you deal with the president going onto national television announcing that the problem at Eskom is primarily sabotage, when in fact it is primarily incompetence? Do you contradict the president in the media and say that he was lying, which of course would cost you your job? Or do you try to play the game and sort of manage your way through media questions in a way that states what the problem is, but also in a way that does not contradict the president? And if you try to do this, how do you do this? Andre de Ruyter's book, Truth to Power, reads like a manual in business management, but also, and very importantly for the South African context, a journey and some very important lessons in political navigation. The story starts with a very eager Andre de Ruyter, hell-bent on fixing Eskom and South Africa's electricity crisis, and ends with him resigning and getting poisoned with cyanide 3 years later. Now, there are many threads in this book that could be followed, but the one that I want to focus on with this video is de Ruyter's quest to get to the root of the problem, to find out why is South Africa in this electricity crisis, and in other words, what ought to be done to fix this problem sustainably. And throughout this journey, de Ruyter goes through several stages identifying problems that could be the root of the electricity crisis, only to find that there are actual deeper underlying issues that need to be dealt with. And I was quite surprised to find what de Ruyter eventually got to. First, sabotage. Sabotage is indeed a serious problem at Eskom. But the problem in blaming the problem on sabotage is that you are externalizing the problem, saying that we are not doing anything wrong at Eskom. The actual problem are external forces who are trying to prevent us from doing our job, when we do know, of course, that that is not a good reflection of the actual problem in Eskom. And so de Ruyter started looking into the problem of incompetence, which is indeed a very serious problem in Eskom. But at a certain stage, you have to ask the question, is the problem really incompetence? Or is it as simple as saying that the problem is incompetence? If your job is to push a button when a machine stops working, and you sit there and you don't push the button, is it because you are incompetent? Or is it perhaps that you are simply just too lazy to do your work? Or is it some other force that's preventing you from doing this? Now, certainly, laziness is a serious problem among Eskom employees. But we do know as well that it's not applicable to every person working at Eskom. There are people at Eskom working tirelessly to literally keep the lights burning at night. But other than that, there seems to be many free riders at Eskom who are not doing their job, who are getting paid, and who are being made up for by their hard-working colleagues. This brought de Ruyter to another level of the problem, which is work ethic. Now, if you want to fix work ethic at a company like Eskom, you have to start at the top, not the bottom. If there's a work ethic problem, it has to do with management. And poor work ethic among certain Eskom executives seems to be a very serious problem, as is evident in de Ruyter's book when he talks about plant managers not even complying with the most basic maintenance requirements. Of course, this doesn't prevent them from wearing expensive suits and long pointy shoes as they stroll around these power plants filled with dust and ash. There seems to be, as de Ruyter points out, zero strategic thinking among certain spheres of Eskom's management, who are too concerned about keeping an intolerant minority happy. Of course, I'm referring to those who are continually threatening with strikes and disruptions if they do not get their way. And their way has nothing to do with proper management at Eskom, and everything to do with their own personal comfort. And if you don't keep these disruptors happy, you are accused of racism and oppression and not caring about the plight of the people. De Ruyter mentions, for example, a union representative who slouched back in his chair and said, "We are not happy, and as long as we are not happy, it's your problem." These people are disrupting the entire enterprise for their own personal gain, and they are rewarded for this instead of being punished. Effectively, what this means is that Eskom is being governed from below by the worst of the worst. Now the big one, corruption. De Ruyter quickly realized that corruption at Eskom is not a low-level thing. That if you try to root out corruption by looking at what's happening on the lower levels, you are only scratching the surface. And that, as De Ruyter points out, for every corrupter, there is a corruptee. And so De Ruyter soon started filing charges and reporting people for corruption, only to realize that for corruption to be dealt with efficiently, you need an executive level at the institution in the first place, committed to rooting out corruption, followed by a police service who are prepared to do their job, followed by a public prosecuting authority who are prepared to prosecute these people, followed by a political climate in which these people are prosecuted and there's no political intervention. Overarching, what we need is a political will, and in South Africa, the political will to deal with corruption does not exist. And so, desperate to do something about the problem, De Ruyter started his own private intelligence unit to find the corruptors and the corruptees and the politicians who are involved with this, which surely is the single biggest contributing factor to his downfall and his poisoning. And so De Ruyter realized that corruption is not the root of Eskom's problems, but a symptom of a bigger underlying problem. He talks about his meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa, where they discussed several serious issues about the crisis in Eskom and what ought to be done. But at the end, De Ruyter concluded that Ramaphosa was simply not prepared to do something about the problem. That he was trying to govern the country much like a country club manager and not like a president. And so here is De Ruyter's conclusion about Ramaphosa's leadership style in his own words. But I could not escape the conclusion that in running the country, he was more of a genial country club manager than a decisive leader. As long as he could keep the golfers and the bowls players out of each other's hair, he was content. In other words, a leader who wants to be all things to all men. You can play darts, I can play golf. Someone else can play tennis. As long as everyone is happy and wearing the same green, black and yellow t-shirt, the president is happy. It's a great way of managing a country club, but no way to run a government. At some stage, the president needs to say, "I've heard all of your input, but here is what we're going to do." And so related to this, De Ruyter expresses his concern about policy creep in South Africa. That South Africa has layers upon layers of policies and requirements which are always implemented with good intentions, or at least proclaimed to be, which only ends up making business in South Africa more and more complicated, making it increasingly difficult to start a business, to manage a business, to employ people, and to contribute to the economy. Through these policies, government is trying very hard to be everything for everybody, only to end up achieving nothing. And so remarkably, De Ruyter reaches the conclusion that a very important underlying problem, or a very important root of Eskom's problems, is not simply corruption. It's not simply the president's leadership style. It's not simply policies and policy creep. It's the structure of the political system. South Africa's political system is structured around elections every 5 years. And if you are in power, you have to use your 5 years to do what you can to maintain that power, to get voted in again at the end of this election. And for a start, you cannot get anything done in the year running up to an election, because fixing a problem implies focusing on the problem. And before an election, government does not want to rock the boat. So it is disincentivized to try to fix anything the year before an election. This effectively means that 20% of the time in South Africa, you cannot do anything of significance to fix the problems in this country. But other than that, if you are in power for 5 years, you have to do what you can to get re-elected at the end of your term, which means that focusing on short-term output is much more important and incentivized than focusing on long-term solutions. For example, handing out social grants and giving people free stuff rewards a politician in a system like this, but initiating the building of a new power station does not. In fact, a politician and a government might even be punished for building a new power station, because before their 5 years are up, people would not see the results. But on top of that, the most important infrastructure maintenance and development issues are the type of things that you do not see, such as infrastructures below the surface. If you spend your time and money maintaining pipelines and municipal infrastructures, people are not going to see the results. But if you don't do this, people are going to see the results, but not immediately. It's like brushing your teeth, the writer says. If you keep brushing your teeth, no one will notice. But if you stop brushing your teeth, it eventually becomes a problem. And once it becomes a serious problem, you cannot fix this problem by giving it a quick brush. So in our political system, brushing your teeth is disincentivized. In fact, it might even be a good thing not to brush your teeth, because you can spend your time and money on short-term issues. And eventually, once the problem kicks in, it will be your successor's problem to deal with, making you look good by comparison. And so we should say the South African electricity crisis was already predicted when Thabo Mbeki was president, and possibly even before. But fortunately, we can end this video on an optimistic note. A dark cloud is hanging over South Africa, not only metaphorically, but this dark cloud has a very important silver lining. It's a classic example of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, which implied that for something new to rise, something old has to be destroyed. And it is often in the ashes of destruction that new solutions come to the fore. We might even say in the South African context that the collapse of South Africa's electricity provider is facilitating the road to a more sustainable solution. For those communities who are prepared to do something about the problem, at least. Eskom is going down, and there's no indication that this ship can be turned around. All these promises of ending load shedding and fixing the electricity crisis are simply there to blind us from the actual reality, which is that all these problems I mentioned before still exist, and there's no indication that they are going away. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. But in the wake of this problem, we see the rise of private electricity generation in South Africa, of electricity generation being deregulated by the South African government, not because they want to, but because they are forced to by reality and the balance of forces. But the fact remains that whether they deregulate or not, people are going to do it, because de facto reality dictates de jure reality, not the other way around. So Bloomberg recently reported that South African companies would add 4 gigawatt to the grid by the end of 2024, and this is obviously increasing. Davie Rood somewhat facetiously said that if you want to make money in South Africa, you need to look at what the South African government ought to be doing and then start a business to do exactly that. On top of that, we of course see all sorts of new technologies that make it possible and easier and cheaper to privately generate electricity. This is a major step towards people becoming more independent of the South African government. But more importantly, a major step to dismantling this destructive political system we have in South Africa. Not by voting it out, but by building it out.